Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Bell's Woodland, Creating a Native Garden from Disturbed Woodland at Chanticleer. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with your organizations, they are largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, and Rescape California. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Przemek Walczak. Przemek is a horticulturalist at Chanticleer Garden, with past experience at the Morris Arboretum and Museum and Garden. Mr. Walczak is originally from Poland, where he worked in the studio for Applied Dendrology at the Center for the Preservation of Historic Landscapes. He lectures and teaches classes and specializes in native plant gardening and supporting native pollinators and birds. Mr. Walczak graduated from the Academy of Life Sciences in Warsaw, Poland, as a Master of Economics and Agriculture major. Welcome, Mr. Walczak.
Thank you very much, Penny. Welcome, everybody. And I'm very happy to share what I've learned and still need to learn at my current job at Chanticleer. I've been, again, my name is Przemek Walczak. I'm one of the horticulturalists here at Chanticleer, and the main part of the talk will focus on designing, installing, and dealing with all the issues related to that of the native woodland garden. As Penny mentioned, I work at Chanticleer, which is a public garden in the suburbs of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. We are a public garden open to the public. We are a nonprofit organization, private nonprofit foundation. The grounds of the garden formerly was a private estate of the Rosengarten family. Mr. Rosengarten, the senior, Adolf Rosengarten Sr., purchased the original piece of land in 1913, and that's where the property dates back to. Eventually became the full-time house, and our founder, the son of the original owner, Mr. Rosengarten Jr., established the foundation and set the rules under which we operate. So, and also left the finances in order and established an endowment. So, not to focus too much on that. We are about 48 acres of area. 36 of that are open to the public, and 4 of that are under my jurisdiction, which encompasses the Bell's Woodland and another piece of open space. The Bell's Woodland name comes from the Bell's Run, which is a creek that traverses the property, and that's what the arrow is pointing to. What happens in a garden, I guess it's determined to a lot by the past, what happened to the land and how it was used. So looking from the historical photograph, this is sometime after World War II. So here's the main house, which the property started from with the 7 acres originally, and Rosengarten's purchased adjacent land eventually. So at this point, we own everything that the streets here border, and then somewhere over here is the end. So what happened before the property became a public garden, some of the structures were removed. There was a house, which is currently, that's part of the Bell's Woods. The driveway that led to the Minder house, which was the living space of Mr. Rosengarten junior, and this house got demolished since we didn't need houses in the garden. So this is what our visitor map looks at the moment. And the visitors come to our parking lot. That's where they're welcomed. And we are not strictly a native plant garden. We use a lot of natives, and there's some areas that are completely native. We do some pretty intense, somewhat crazy gardening surrounding the houses, the main house over here, and then the building next to the visitor center where we welcome visitors. And I'll focus on that very briefly just to give you a taste of Chanticleer, and then describe a couple projects along the way. One is the elevated walkway, and then the ruined garden, and then we'll move on to Bell's Woods and what happens there. So just briefly to go around the garden, this is where the visitors would arrive and get greeted by our visitor services staff. We are open from April to October, 5 days a week, Wednesday through Sunday, from 10 to 5. And hence our visitor pavilion is an open structure, and sometimes maybe chilly in the spring or fall. This is where you purchase the tickets. We wrote a book about our garden, and actually most of the staff were involved in the writing of the book. Big part of the garden is wooded with some open spaces. When we don't need lawn, we'll get rid of it, and we'll cover some of that. So the teacup garden adjacent to the visitor center is very intensely gardened. Lots of containers, tropicals, subtropicals, and any crazy plant we have or we can get our hands on. Definitely mixed with some native plants. The trees up above are river birches. These are actually box alders, the Acer negundo. So in early spring, there's not that much going on yet, so we'll push it a little bit. We use all kinds of things for the early display. And the more intense displays are obviously be by the houses, and then it sort of gets more loose and evolves both the style and intensity and the plant palette. So the teacup garden changes quite a bit through the season and from year to year, and this is just a taste of it. So bulbs, some edible things as yearly display, where some of the lettuces are more cold tolerant, and cool season vegetables make interesting ornamentals. Some of the tropicals and tropical plants that we use were overwinter. Some we treat as annuals, and we try to be as sustainable as possible. So whatever we can overwinter reasonably, that would provide us with quality plants in the spring and not break the budget, we'll definitely accommodate that. We use some hardy tropical things like kind of a misnomer, but the bananas back here are Musa Baju, which is this hardy here, and it's been growing in that corner for over 30 years, I think, close to 30. So moving on, this is the courtyard in the front of the main house, the Chanticleer house, which I mentioned, that's where the property started. The only constant thing in the garden, in the landscape, is change. So when I first came here as a visitor, this cherry was about maybe 8 feet tall, and this was a blazing sun courtyard. And now it's pretty much a shade garden with hydrangeas and hellebores and lilies and such. The center still has enough sun to accommodate agaves, but the rest of it is pretty much a shade garden. just around the corner by the main house. Again, this is the very intensely gardened area, and changes through the seasons and from year to year. We are definitely leaning and striving towards sustainability. So whatever we don't need or can change for the better, we try to do it. So this was just a standard formal lawn that we found boring, and we didn't want to mow all the time. So we turned it into a bulb or flowery lawn, where there's only a strip of mowed lawn on the border, and then the rest is a mixture of fine fescues, and then through the season different plants interplanted in it. So instead of you keep using the disposable bulbs like tulips and such that will get thrown away after they finish blooming, these will take deliberately the varieties that will naturalize and perennialize well, and they've been here for quite a few years, and both adjusting the planting depth and choosing the right varieties, we can maintain them as perennial plants. And through the seasons, once they're done, we play with tropicals, mostly subtropicals, tender perennials, and some annuals and whatever. One year, this was probably the densest place for monarchs because we had some tropical milkweeds and they really liked them. So, and then later there would the chrysalises would adorn the sculptures and furniture. Down a hill around the corner, this is a little bit jumping the gun because we're talking about soils in the woods. This is an example of how to do a project well and not ruin the soil. Soils are, in my mind, our biggest resource, and we're really mistreating them. So anything we can do to protect them and work with them instead of ruining them and working against them and then have to undo what we did later, which is both costly and difficult. So originally the main path that navigates the garden went straight down this hill, which when it was built, the American with Disabilities Act was just going to effect, and this one definitely did not comply with it. So trying to remedy it, and because it was difficult to walk on it for everybody, we decided to build an elevated walkway, since it would be a lot less impact on the site. Trying to achieve the proper grade to comply with ADA, this hillside would have to be completely destroyed. We have to cut and fill so much that there will be not original surface left. So being a general contractor, we control the access to the site. The contractors follow our guidance how to deal with the soil. So no equipment was allowed on unprotected soil. So all the excavation, the drilling for the piers was done when the machine was actually on either plywood or alternate mats that, and you could see them scattered around it. Also, what helped was that the ground was frozen through most of that. You can see the fence, the tree protection fences. This is actually dictated by our township that they have to be fixed. So the pipes, the posts are 2-inch pipes that are actually 2 feet into the ground, 6-foot chain link fence. The contractors are not allowed to move it at all. And that's basically result of the old sort of snow fence looking construction fences that contractors will move at will and disregard them. So this forces them not to do that. Plus, we wouldn't allow it. I mean, being a general contractor, we set the rules. So this is following the construction. The deck of the pavement was, we chose as a porous pave, which is completely porous. The water goes right through it. And Within this, previously the ground here was under turf, so we got rid of the turf. We then amended to raise the fertility of the site just to increase the biological activity. So we use amendment that would stimulate that and then plant it right into it without any tilling. And this is later this in the season, and this has been in for about 4 years, and it's the plants are thriving. One section of the garden that we feature different agricultural crops. This squiggly area that we call the serpentine, and different agricultural crops are used as ornamentals, and it brings the awareness to what some of the food is, at least, is coming from to a visitor, and it's also quite interesting visually. So this a few years back, this was kale, different color varieties. We use different grains. This is rye. We had wheat, barley, oats, and canola, corn. This is rice. We had tobacco, sesame, and some other things. One interesting thing about it is how we deal with the soil. This soil hasn't been tilled for about 10 years now. So we practiced a no-till practice, and this was rice, and just recently it got mowed with the sickle bar and then mulched with the mower, and so all the straw stayed in place and covering the ground, and whatever, depending on what crop it is, that's what we do, or we mulch it with leaves. Probably the biggest project in the garden, both cost and how big of an area it covered, was the construction of the ruined garden. This was the Minder house where Mr. Rosengarten Jr. Lived and actually died. So in 2000, it was actually torn down to the ground, but then the ruin was rebuilt on the same site, the folly. So the walls and the openings match exactly the previous house. What was not so great about this project is that there was some extensive grading done, and because of the elevation changes, the soil had to be compacted to a certain degree to be stable, and the fill that was used was basically subsoil. So not many things wanted to grow in this kind of conditions, and plus the soil was extremely hard. So a plant that could do well in this situation was Prairie dropseed grass, which is Sparabolis heterolepis. We planted with using a drill, an auger, and plugs, and it filled in really quickly. Sparabolis grows best if it's burned, being a prairie grass. So actually, a fire department helps us with that, and they train their young recruits by letting them burn our Sparabolis, and that's their brush fire training. And it benefits us because the grasses actually do grow better, and it makes it quite interesting landscape. Interesting thing is, even the toughest plants sometimes have hard time. So you see the difference in the shapes of those, the crowns of the Sparabolis in the front, and then the other ones look more like pancakes. So there's some difference in what the soil was like, and they behave differently. These guys wouldn't bloom. These guys would bloom pretty reliably. So we did take some measures to improve the soil. We used a product called, there's few of them on the market, and they were called as a group coreless aerators. So it's a compound containing some vermicompost and humates and polysaccharides. So they stimulate fungal activity in the soil, and which helps loosen up heavy soils, and that worked well. We also used other amendments and mulched it with leaves. So Sparabolis is fulfilling its function, and it does bloom, and it's quite a successful planting. This is just more to indicate that the gardens are habitat for a lot of different creatures, including insects and pollinators who are having a kind of rough time these these days, all the insects and pollinators especially. So maybe that's not the best example of how to house them, but quite a few of them do move in, and you could see some of the holes are already occupied here. And we construct other solitary bee houses, but the best thing is to just provide habitat for them to nest in nature. A small vegetable garden is part of the display, and we are maintaining it completely organically. And we do eat some of the produce, and some gets donated to the food pantry and women's shelter. One of our greenhouses that we stored our tropical and subtropical plants doubles as a picnic house, and so this is in the summer where all these plants are out. So, but not to the important things, the Bell's Woods. There's a few little mottos or creeds that I guess people go by. So this is one of mine. This is the green is a Polish version. That the translation is mine, so maybe it's not perfect, but I think of the garden as landscape as a garden. So we need to take care of those gardens, landscapes, because they will take care of us in return. This is one of the friendly gardeners that visits us sometimes, and he said that there's a fine line between a wild garden and a big mess. So I try to walk that line, and hopefully I'm somewhat successful. And this is sort of paraphrasing a little thing from a TV show, but I think it's an extremely important part of what we do, and maybe we shouldn't be obsessed with this, but think about it a lot. So back to the map of the garden, we'll focus on the Bell's Woods and what's happening there. So whatever happened to that area beforehand has a big influence on what's happening there now and how we can go about turning it into the garden. Before we started gardening there, as in the history of the property, this part was never gardened. So there was no any design or conscious effort to maintain it as a garden. It was sort of a perimeter woodland. And one of the houses that got torn down was located there, which we'll talk about in a moment. The biggest thing that happened to it was this. This was a construction of a sewer line. So the township, in the name of progress, had to build that, which it did improve the water quality in the creek and a pond dramatically, because all the leaky septic systems contributed to making the creek kind of messy. So all the extra nutrients ended up in the sewer line. However, we lost a lot of trees in the woods, and as the direct result of this gigantic disturbance, we lost probably half of the canopy in this area. Because it's not only the trees that got directly affected by the excavation and compaction and roots being torn by the excavation, but all the hydrology got disrupted here. So the trees are still suffering. Over 20 years later, there's still repercussions for the mature trees that were there. So basically, this was a big trench, very deep, because this was the bottom end of the sewer line. So the virgin clay, like the subsoil, got brought to the surface and then compacted after it was refilled. The house that was torn down, so there was a house in the garage here for quite a few years, and then whatever happened, and the driveway going out to the street. So whatever happened back then, when the house was still there, still lingers, and then the demolition and removal of the house had effect on that land as well. There was a dirt road that went through the woods, and for whatever reason, we drove tractors and golf carts and other equipment through there, and that had influenced what happens in the woods. Also, a concrete pod behind the potting shed where we used to compost things, and a gravel road that led to it. And it was actually gravel and cinders from coal-fired furnaces. And the last place that was the main house was heated with coal and 2 coal-fired furnaces. So this is where the ashes, the cinders, got discarded, and so they about a foot below ground level now, but they're still there, and they created an impervious layer below that, 10 inches to 12 of soil. So all these activities could contribute to soil degradation and erosion. This is just a dramatic example, not a Chanticleer. And so compaction, water cannot infiltrate, it runs down a hill, that could create erosion. The compacted organic layer gets degraded, the soil structure gets ruined, and the porous space is collapsed, and so it changes the biological activity in the soil and physical structure of it. So all the things that could contribute to soil degradation and erosion. During construction, that often happens, and when the houses are built, the organic layer gets removed and carted away, and the equipment distorts and degrades the organic layer. Compaction, contamination, the cinders that got dumped in the woods and the remnants of the house contaminate the soil and cause problem. How the water moves through the landscape, whatever we do, it could channel it, and that could create its own problems. How we use the land, whether it's for lawn or garden or something else, it could cause compaction and all the other things as well. How we maintain it. So how we mow, if we mow always the same pattern, then we could create these rounds of compacted soil because the wheels go over the same place. So alternating the mowing pattern would help alleviate that. Doing things in a garden when the soil on the landscape where it's too wet. Maybe sometimes adjusting the schedule is the better thing to do than trying to be exactly on schedule, but then causing other trouble. Leaving the soil uncovered, the example how we're not doing it is in that serpentine area that I pointed out earlier. So leaving the leaf litter or the plant debris in place, or actually live plants. So in the woods itself, we shred some of the leaves. That helps them stay in place. Maybe they'll break down a little faster, but they don't get blown away and accumulate in certain places. Also, plants that wouldn't benefit from, since this is not exactly natural setting, because we try to maintain it more intensely than exactly natural woodland. So say some flaxes and lower ground covers, they might potentially get smothered. So mulching the leaves help to prevent that, and we do it where we need to, not everywhere. And where there's plant cover, sometimes the unshredded leaves are just fine between the plants, and let it be. Compaction, once happens, it will not fix itself, unless not for really, really long time. The U.S. Forest Service came back to old logging roads 40 years later, and although they weren't driven on anymore, the compaction has not alleviated itself. It was still the same. So it's better to prevent it than trying to undo it later. To restore the soil, we need to learn what are we restoring it to. So knowing what the soil actually is, how it behaves, and what's in it is essential to trying to restore it to where it needs to be. Different amendments is biochar. I will not get too much into it, what it is. Just briefly, biochar is the byproduct of burning wood in a process called pyrolysis. This with less oxygen than regular burning, so most of the carbon stays behind in a stable form, and added to the soil, it improves drainage in heavy soils like clay soils, but it also could do just the opposite in the sandy soil. It would actually improve water holding capacity because of its structure, and it interacts with soil particles and minerals in the soil and microorganisms in such a way that improves the soil quality overall. Compost, both as a verb and as a noun, so to use compost as an amendment, but also to compost things that we have to remove from the landscape. So all the debris at Chanticleer will compost. We have a compost setup that's actually working very well for us. Hugelculture is one of the methods of which I use as restoration method for both soil and in the woods, but it's also a way of growing vegetables, which is kind of I'm borrowing from permaculture. This is more for interest. Korean natural farming. There's a way of dealing with the land farming that involves employing naturally occurring microorganisms. So basically, the main premise is that you collect mainly fungi from healthy, say, old-growth forest, multiply them, and then apply them to your soil to improve it. Sounds like a good idea. I can't find a practitioner that could teach me that and actually explain exactly how good the fungal diversity is. So sounds like a good idea. I'm not quite there yet. I'm not totally convinced that they could work for us. There's a lot of interesting things happening in the regenerative agriculture. We're going away from using chemical fertilizers and pesticide, and bringing back the soil microbiology, restores the soils and helps with carbon sequestration and actually rebuilding the soil. So this is one of the methods, and it stands for biologically enhanced agricultural management. It was developed by David C. Johnson from New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And there's quite a bit of information about it. And I have links to it in the at the end of the presentation. So it wouldn't be nice to change it to biologically enhanced horticulture management, and that would be called BAM. So that was sort of a joke, but I think there's a potential there. So if the compaction already had happened and we need to deal with it, one way to do it is mechanically, basically breaking up the broken soil. And the best way to, one of the ways is digging, whether it's an excavator or a shovel, spade, or other air spade is one of those pieces of equipment, which I'll explain a little later. Auger, so drilling into the soil. It all depends on the accessibility to the site, what would be the best method, and what's feasible. So this is the and it could be you could use water injections as do similar things. So, but the main thing is it's a mechanical intervention. Organic amendments, soil injections, that would do some of the physical part, but also whatever is in a solution, say fish hydrolysate and humates, other things like that, that could then influence the biology of the soil. Biochar, I mentioned before. Building organic layer above the affected area. Sometimes because it's not feasible, maybe because of financial reasons or whatever it is that's compacted heavily. Paul Stamens, he's a mycologist. He does a lot of interesting things with fungi. He's out of Washington State. In his book called Mycelium Running, he proposed dealing with logging roads in this way, where instead of digging it up, which would then loosen it up and allow the water to carry the sediments down to the streams and then cause a mess because interfering with salmon spawning and all that stuff. So he said, leave it in place and put 12 inches of inoculated wood chips, which would turn into soil, 4 inches of soil in a year, and the vegetation can move through, the roots can connect from one side to the other of the road, and herbaceous plants can grow in it happily. Similar thing could be achieved with Hugelculture and other amendments, micronutrients, all that stuff. So building organic layer above affected area with other methods that Hugelculture and Hugelculture, all the amendments together, and using both of those methods by amending the soil and intervening mechanically, we can jumpstart the process of soil restoration. Airspade can be used to break up, loosen up the soil. Here we're using it to, this is at the elevated walkway where we made sure that when we put the piers in or a retaining wall, we excavated, found where the tree roots were, we cut them clean, which then they can generate new fine roots at the end of that. The roots get crushed, excavating equipment, they would decompose, they start rotting, and it would not generate new roots. So it causes trouble for the tree. And Airspade was originally developed as an excavation tool to find utilities in the ground, like pipes and cables and wires. So it works. It was adopted by arborists and horticulturists for the same purpose, but dealing with roots. Good tool for radial trenching around trees to improve the soil there. This area, this was a gravel road that led to the compost bin, compost pod behind the potting shed. It was loosened up with the Airspade, amended with compost, biochar, and then we used the Airspade to mix it in, and then replanted with Pachysandra procumbens here. Once I started gardening in the woods, I had to deal with a lot of invasive plants. So I understand that there might be participants from different parts of the country, so not all of them will be pertinent to where you are. These are some of our worst offenders. Lesser celandine, or Ficaria verna, or Ranunculus ficaria is the older name. Horrible plant, came from Europe. It affects the floodplains and along the waterways, and hard to get rid of, a big pain. Japanese steelgrass, pretty much omnipresent up on the East Coast, and it's doable. Again, it's there's some work to be done. Garlic mustard, burning bush, woody shrub, horrible, should be banned. Myelimina, that's an annual, that's a vine, pretty bad. Hairy bittercress or cardamom, that's a winter annual. It has several cycles through the year, so pretty persistent. Some of the woody stuff, devil's walking stick, oriental bittersweet, that's a vine, pretty. The last two, I really don't like them, so they're not as invasive as some of the other ones. English ivy, the birds spread the seeds. Japanese Pachysandra, mostly planted by humans. How we go about controlling those? Herbicide is the easiest choice. As I mentioned earlier, we try to be as gentle on the landscape as possible. We still do herbicide in some instances, both organic and the traditional. Systemic herbicide are the ones that get translocated and affect the whole plant. So there's both selective and non-selective ones. So non-selective would kill obviously anything that comes in contact with, or potentially. Selective would target specific groups of plants. Contact herbicide, and they both could be both systemic and contact herbicide could be organic or not organic. Some of the organic ones, they're fairly effective. They could be a little, might need more than one application. And so there's some, for the contact ones, there's fatty acids, like argonic acid, and also oils, like clover oil, and some citrus-based ones. As systemic ones go, there's some iron compounds that work as systemic herbicide. And Some of the traditional ones are more effective. We try to use it sparingly as a tool to knock some things out. Mechanical intervention, pulling, cutting, digging, hoeing. All of these things will cause disturbance. So the less disturbance, the better, because disturbed soil would sunlight causes germination of a lot of weed seeds. So we use those sparingly. Pulling when relevant. Cutting, and it could be anywhere just below ground, say with the steak knife, excellent weeding tool, or above ground. And depending on what, knowing your weeds is important here, because some annuals you can keep them down pretty effectively without letting them go to seeds. Thermal, flame, and steam. Steam, I don't think they're available in the US yet. I know in Canada there's some steam machines that deliver superheated steam for killing weeds, and they're very effective. I would love to have one, but flame, we use different size of torches, propane torches, one with a 10 pound tank in the backpack, and another one with a smaller, the kind of cane style, very precise weeder, and they're very effective. Goats are used as biological and some other things, but not feasible for us. Ficalia verna, horrible weed. This is what a lot of floodplains look like in the Middle East. I'm sorry, in the Mid Atlantic, and that's kind of the reality of it. Came from Europe here. The biggest problem is that it has this multiple bulbets. They easily dislodge from the soil, and water carries it around, and it produces the extra ones along the stem that's lay on the surface and easily dispersed, and then the seeds in as well. Best method for me was actually spraying it with systemic herbicide and then mopping it up so I can do some spot weeding. Microstagium, not letting go to seed is a pretty effective method, but not just mulling, but cutting it just before it would go to flower normally. Weeding is effective too. It depends on your maintenance regimens. Garlic mustards, same thing. Euonymus salatus, the burning bush, horrible weed. Dealing with water. So stormwater, considering where the water is coming from. So how it is getting to you, if it's just rainwater or is it channeled from the neighbor, from the road. Improving infiltration would definitely help to minimize that. So anything you do to improve the soil helps with that. Slowing it down, so letting it spill over bigger areas. I use Hugelculture in the woods to help with that. Controlling erosion by both redistributing the water over bigger area, and sometimes you might have to change your planting schemes to help with that, or even resort to physical things like landscape erosion control mats and stuff as a temporary measure. Porous pavement helps to both infiltrate and then store some of the water and let it infiltrate slower. Roof runoff, green roofs and such, expensive but effective. So this is a small little project in the woods that on the edge of the woods that improved the area at floodplain. Basically, we rebuild the floodplain here. We lowered the grade here to allow the creek to spill, and we let the water in the storm events travel more peacefully through the landscape. So here, during the construction, we expected the storm. We protected the site with the tarps to not let it erode. The access was we protected the soil with these big mats that basically build a road to access the site for what we needed to do. Biologs to stabilize the bank, and erosion control mats to protect the slopes. We covered the whole site. This is January, we couldn't plant yet, and here's where the biolog went in. And then this is woven coconut core mat that protected the site. Mulched with leaves and planted through the mat. So several species of calyxes and grasses, and and other things mixed in it within. So quite a bit of planting. Carex pennsylvanica, the last one that went in. Why acquiring the plants? Plugs work well in some places. This is the bigger one. This is, they call it deep fours, which is almost a quart-sized pot. Would establish quite quickly. So different stages to make a little adjustment here, sort of make our own biolog to plug it and blend it in, plant it, and it's holding up very well. And the water actually came up and out the banks, but fluffed the Carex radiata here, and nothing ever happened. So hopefully this is an ideal space and contains some magic, serenity, sorcery, and mystery. I don't know, maybe Tess is doing some magic there, and Peter practices serenity. So this is later in the season. This is late in the season, probably August. And another space where I couldn't spread the water too far. This is a swale that the water moves through. So putting plants in there that would put up with these sort of conditions. Carex chirocensis, Carex socialis, turtle heads or Chelonia glabra, Lyonia, excuse me, and then different ferns like cinnamon, royal fern, and marsh fern. And they're colonizing that and holding the soil while the water moves through the landscape. So a little wider view of the same area. So sometimes this area would stay wet for weeks at a time if we had continuous rain. And but these plants can put up with this. And some even volunteer, like this Persicaria virginiana that showed up on its own, and then this Napia dioica, which is actually quite beautiful, and it showed up on its own and actually collected seeds, propagated it, and using it more in the landscape. Sometimes you need to just sit back and think about what to do and how is it going. So I need access to the woods, so we designed this bridge that looks like a log to create a sort of sense of entrance, and did some modeling, and that's the end result. Same thing from the side. And the path that went through the woods, didn't want to disturb the woods anymore than we have to, so we actually put the path at the grade, and where the water had to move through it, we put drains, several of them along the way, and the pavement is a rubber pavement. It's soft to walk on and looks very natural. Plant diversity, very important. We try to make it as diverse as possible, and this is one of the native perennial morning glories, and it's a host for interesting insects. Not using cultivars is important. Few here and there is one thing, but they do not produce pollen and or nectar, so they're kind of useless for the insects. Some of them will provide longer show than than the straight species, so balancing that is very important. Plant selection here, sources for plants. This was actually trilliums, so I learned a lot how to buy or not to buy trilliums, and this is a more intensely designed area than some of the other ones. So as the trilliums fade in, the Spigelia is showing up and taking over, and then takes its own righteous place later in the season. And it's a nice background for other things. Excellent native perennial. Using the right plants in the right places. Carex, Carex Eburnia or ivory sedge really wants to be on a little bit of a slope and doesn't want to grow here. So I have to adjust and not to be boorish about it, and figure out better way to get what I want to see, but not necessarily fight it. Mosses, I love them, try to use them as much as I can. This was installed, this happened on its own. The conditions were such that the moss just wanted to grow here. So this tree deflects the water that goes around this moss, so it doesn't get disturbed. I occasionally blow the leaves off of it, and that's maybe weeded a couple times a year, but that's really it. And then eventually different mosses take place, and the pioneering ones get displaced with the different ones. What's happening here, it's a different part of the garden. Different plant selections, love ferns, and use them different places, lots of carex and other native plants. As I mentioned, we lost a lot of trees. This was a beautiful big beech tree, and it's gone. So these are the root sprouts that we'll maintain as a grove and select some, and eventually they will become a bigger trees. Special plants like Valeriana passiflora, it's a floodplain plant, so it's very versatile. It grows in different places. It mixes well with almost anything. It's a nice ground cover, and it lasts really long time, which is important in the season because it's still very showy later in the season. Hugelculture. It's a way of gardening where wood is used to build up mounds, and mixed with soil and compost and all this stuff, it provides favorable conditions for plants. It's used a lot in the vegetable growing, in permaculture. Here I use it more as a restoration method because wood really belongs in the woods, so it should be left alone. So logs should stay on the ground and decompose because the soil needs carbon, and if we in the woods, say, if the forest gets clear cut, the depth of the soil gets cut by half. So from 12-inch soil, it's 6 when the new generations of trees starts to grow there. And so that was probably one of the bigger mistakes, that I removed all those logs when we had to cut down the trees because we didn't know any better. This was over 20 years ago. So this is kind of a rough idea of how hugelculture works. Bunch of wood mixed with soil and other organic matter, and then the plants growing on top of it. That's a little exaggerated, and maybe you could do it, you know, in a vegetable garden situation. In the woods, I'd rather keep it as natural as possible. So naturally, this tree is dead. So you could see the first generation of primary decomposing fungi. The bark falls off, and as it breaks down and gets back into the soil, this tree fell down, and it's my hugelculture actually built some smaller hugels next to it, and the plants are starting growing actually in the wood. This was a low spot, so it was kind of a puddle. So putting some hugels here allows me to grow interesting plants there where the water still can move in between them to traverse that slope. And this is the same log maybe 5-6 years later, and there's happily native woodland plants growing there. Probably not the best way to start hugels. I learned from my mistakes. Too much of a brush piled on top of each other and with some green vegetation. All of these things can go into a hugel, but just in a more organized way, because when soil is added to it, it creates huge air cavities there, and chipmunks like it a lot, and then the plants on top dry out. So this is the hugel this year. Actually, it's probably 5 years old, and it's actually successful. Now, I had to fill in some of the spaces with more soil, and that one was more deliberately and with more experience constructed. And this is here it is now. Excuse me. This log is, whoops, that one, and it's full of, there's probably 20 different species of plants growing on top of that. I use different kinds of wood in it. This is all mostly hardwood, but this is fresh tulip poplar that was just cut down. This is probably 3 years old poplar, and they're both fine to use. And different examples, expansions, easier to use bigger stuff, and organizing it better, laying it down so then the material, that's the soil that gets mixed in between, can settle down better. Small ones, it is a lot of fun, as you could see here. And these things will barely be above ground, but just enough to give the plants a kickstart. And as the wood breaks down, it provides them with nitrogen and other things. Small one, I would just wanted this special spot right here to grow something special. This is the site where the house was torn down, so the soils are still working its way out of that funk, and use the same thing later. That person actually from New Zealand came to play with us. Lots of water moved to this site, so putting the smaller hugels to allow the water to move through it is allowing these plants to establish. Once the wood is mostly broken down, these things will be barely above the soil level. So it's basically to jumpstart the plants and give them better chance to establish and gets bigger. A small one, this is curve of the path to kind of blend the hide the path, and also that was a somewhat low spot. These are all foreigners, Irish, English, from Tennessee. Again, quite diverse bunch of plants. This is an older one settling nicely into the landscape. So this is borrowed from somebody else's talk, but quite a few subjects that we covered. Choosing appropriate plants for the right places, considering how they affect the surrounding area affects what you're doing. This was specifically for stormwater, actually, but I think it works. So important things to think about as you approach project. Thinking about how you're going to maintain that site, and obviously good to check on things. And same thing, remember what I said about compaction, it will cost a lot more long-term to undo it than, and those will be sort of hidden costs, than protect the soil to begin with. And we're coming to a close here, so I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions you have, you'd like to follow up, feel free to email me. I'll have a contact information. Hopefully this is a wild garden, not a big mess, and it looks good in different times of the year, and even the end of the season colors are quite interesting. Thank you very much. Here's the website of our company, Chanticleer. My name and my email address if you have any follow-up questions. We have a few sources of information and some of the things I touched on. And so if you have any more questions, please, let's try to answer them.
Thank you, Przemek. That was fascinating. We do have several questions, and we are very short of time. So I'm going to get through these quickly, and we'll try to merge a few of them as we go. One question, at what rate are you adding biochar to the soil?
So from my few years of working with it, I think there's something that no more than 5% of total volume. I'm kind of spoiled now because what we do, we actually add the biochar to the beginning to our, as we stack our compost piles. So any compost that comes out of from our composting site has biochar in it. So so we're already adding time we add compost, we incorporate biochar into it, and that goes also into our potting mixes. So, but if I remember correctly, it was something like any more than 5%, you're not doing anything better. So the improvements won't be tangible. So I think 3 to 5%, I think is max what you would need to.
All right. The next question is about, you mentioned building an organic layer above compacted areas. And one question was about, is it just wood chips? And if so, any specific type? Another question related to this is, won't that create a problem having two separate strata that will make it difficult for transitioning from one layer to the next?
So this was for very specific situations. Say one with examples that I mentioned was over a logging road which had some gravel in it. So disturbing that would be worse for the environment than building on top of that. So in the example from Paul Stamets that I mentioned, they actually inoculated the wood chips, hardwood wood chips, and they inoculated them with different strains of fungi. Sometimes what I do is when we screen compost, I take the compost overs and use that both in Hugelcultures and situations like that, or as a top layer. So that's a good source. And I think of it as, if it's limited area, I think of it as a shallow soil, basically. So like you say, if you have a bedrock and then the, shallow soil on top of it. So I think of it as that. So hopefully that answers it.
Okay. Next question, how often is the Spirabolus bed burned?
If we can, we burn it every year. When we first planted it, we tried to cut it, but quickly the crowns got too tall to go over it with the mower because both the wheels would knock it over. Plus, Spirabolus is hard to mow, so technically we're not allowed to burn it. So it is only by the grace of a fire department, and they come and do it basically for us because that's the fire training and they're allowed to do it. So, but it does definitely way better if it could be burned every year.
Okay. You mentioned leaf litter a few times. Are you mulching in place? Are you removing some of the leaves and mowing? And then if you are mulching separately, how long do you compost the leaves before you return them to the beds?
So we kind of do it all. So in the woods, I don't remove any leaves. In the woods, I mow them all. So sometimes, say if I have like Flux-stolonifer, I don't want the leaves caking down on top of them, I would just blow them off that small area to the adjacent area. So I'm not removing them technically, just rearranging. Where I can, I'll leave them unshredded. So Pachysandra procumbens, it sticks out just fine through the leaves, fall in between. And on the lawns, when the leaves start to fall, we would just mulch them. If they get too heavy, we use our mowers that can collect them, and then that goes into our compost. We actually get some extra leaves from the township that are freshly shredded, and sometimes when we want extra organic matter and more leaf cover, we use, like the example in the talk was when we did the project along the creek. Those were actually leaves that we brought in, but they were partially shredded from the collecting process. So I don't know if I muddied or answered it, but so you could use the leaves fresh. I wouldn't go too thick because being partially shredded, then they would mat down. So being judicial there. We also compost some of the leaves, whether we turn the pile or actually use the more active composting process. And then they're not completely decomposed yet, but then we use it instead of other mulches or top dressing.
All right.
So we do it all. We use composted and fresh leaves as well.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about deer. Do you have a problem at Chanticleer? And if so, what do you do?
We would have a problem. I mean, we used to. No, we have a fence. So in that respect, we don't have a problem. Deer is a huge problem, and some of the weed and worm problems are actually very much exaggerated. I mean, exasperated by deer, because the more deer, the more invasive earthworms they are. There's somehow correlation with that. So yeah, we're kind of spoiled that we do have a fence, and that makes life a lot easier.
Yes, very much easier. The next question is on what was the paving surface of that pathway through the woodland?
So in the woods itself, we have it's pure rubber, so it's shredded rubber that's pigmented, and it's a mixture of 3 colors, and then it's poured in place. So it is the wood chips are all held together, and it's somewhat pretty soft. It's pedestrian and light vehicle or traffic. So I can drive my golf cart on it, but I can't use it as a road. And it's completely porous, and it's been in place for over 10 years, and it's holding up very well. The brand name was Rainbow Turf for it. I think that it's a different name. So if you Google it by that name, it should come up, because I think somebody else bought the company, so they changed the name. It is still available. And we also use the elevator walkway head. The brand name is Porous Pave. That's a mixture of pallets of rubber and gravel, and also of different colors, so you can get different color mixes. And that's also fully permeable, and that allows regular vehicular traffic.
All right. Just time for two quick last questions. Does the air spade process kill beneficial soil organisms?
Well, usually we use the air spade where there aren't many of them. So it definitely disrupts the soil. There's no question about it. I mean, but the end result is to rebuild them. So we use it where we would amend the soil then to improve the biological activity in the soil. So I can't think that it's benign, but it's definitely, the end result is that there's more biological activity than before it was done.
Okay. And the last question we have time for, did you do any counts of salamanders or other invertebrates before or after the project?
So not officially. So we definitely find them quite a bit. I mean, there's a lot of salamanders, and we're actually in process of setting up a full biodiversity audit of the whole garden, all the insects, water creatures, and amphibians and reptiles and so on. So we will have those numbers hopefully soon, but we observe what we can, but there wasn't no formal count.
Thank you so much, Przemek, for sharing this inspiring story of the woodland transformation, as well as the other parts of the garden at Chanticleer that you shared with us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.